Hey everybody, I'm here to make a response video made by John Stossel and ReasonTV about capitalism.
Life being wrecked by the super rich?
The super rich. Who are they and what are they doing to us?
What are they doing to us?
Now before I begin, I just want to make this very, very clear. I do prefer capitalism more than any other economic system like socialism, communism, fascism. But then again, you have to understand that Stossel does not talk about the inefficiencies and flaws of capitalism. And this is why I believe sometimes higher taxes and regulation can actually be a good thing. Although that is rarely the case, sometimes it can be. Now, before I go on, I just want to point out that John Stossel and his ties with the Reason Foundation, this is an organization that's heavily funded by the Koch brothers. And in this channel, we're very critical of many other billionaires, no matter what side of the political spectrum they are, whether it's the Koch brothers, Soros, Bloomberg, Steyer, many of these other billionaires that are interested primarily in advancing their agenda, spreading lies and misinformation to get what they want. Now, it's true. Capitalism seems like a very functional system. I have private property. The government is there to protect it, to keep the rules at a minimum, to provide protection, police, military, and people are voluntary to choose what they want. Sounds like a very fair system. But sometimes you have to understand that that exchange between two parties may not be so functional, whether they're buying goods or whether they're exchanging labor. And more importantly, what you have to really understand is that sometimes capitalism can lead to many other types of disruptions. One of the things that we see with the issues of capitalism is that it leads to either oligarchies or monopolies. So in other words, one of the things that ends up happening is that, well, usually in a capitalist society, even though people are free to open other businesses, in some sectors of the economy, it isn't always the case. So for an example, now if you look at particularly food, usually that is not a natural monopoly or oligarchy, where if some food price is too high or unhealthy, person A could easily buy land across the street and grow food on it and deliver a competitive alternative. However, nevertheless, now despite that, we do have literally 5 or 6 mega agricultural giants, including Monsanto, that control a lot of the food, but every sector is different. You have to look at technology. Right now, you have kind of a duopoly or an illusion of choice, like as George Carlin has mentioned it, Microsoft and Apple. You have very few companies that control a lot of things. Facebook, Google, a lot of these other tech giants. You look at the banking system. You look at only 5, 6 mega banks that control much of the banking industry. You look at energy. You look at many of these other sectors. Now, many people can argue, well, they lobbied and got government control. But then here's the other thing. If you look back about 100 years ago, we had the Gilded Age, Standard Oil, and there was hardly any government regulation at that time. We were really almost a true capitalist society. And then even if you go back in the 1980s and 90s during Reagan and Clinton, we had lots of deregulation, and yet we saw a mass merger of mergers and acquisitions. So how do you explain that? Yes, it's true, while big corporations may lobby to limit their competition, sometimes deregulation may not always be a good thing. And this is why sometimes regulation in the economy, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is not really being enforced, and perhaps the Glass-Steagall Act, which broke up investment in commercial banks, and the ending in 1999 was one of the main causes of the 2008 financial crisis, repealed by the Clinton administration. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people supported Bernie Sanders, by the way, was one of the main causes of the downturn, and shows you that sometimes regulation does actually work. Now, if you take a look at an example closer to home, right now you have 2 companies that obviously control more than half of the gaming activity in the Las Vegas Strip, MGM Resorts International and Caesars Entertainment. And as a result, all these mergers and acquisitions, has limited competition, has risen the prices. This is how you get the resort fees, the parking fees, and as a result, they've become so large and powerful that they've now become a very large lobbying force, along with the Culinary Workers Union, to manipulate our legislation, particularly our state governor, Mr. Sisolak, and Brian Sandoval. So sometimes you have to understand that this is one of the flaws of capitalism. And the question is, well, if you don't want to pay the parking fee, well, then why should you park there? Well, the problem with capitalism is that consumers may not always be smart enough to know the decisions that is best for themselves, for their health, and everything else. So maybe they're naive enough to pay $30 for parking, $30 for a drink, and they may be so naive enough to just smoke lots of cigarettes that put their health in danger. One of the flaws of capitalism is that consumers tend to buy products and services that may not always be the most healthy and the most safe products for themselves. This is one of the issues, and this is why governments impose health and safety standards. And so it leads to a lot of oligarchies. And speaking of Nevada, we didn't have a lot of regulations enforced to break up, or vice versa, where it allowed and encouraged the mergers and acquisitions occurred. Because remember, we're a state with very limited taxes and regulations compared to others. But more importantly, in the Gilded Age, we saw lots of mergers and acquisitions. And it really wasn't until the Progressive era that brought us the labor laws and the trust busting and everything else. Mr. Stossel doesn't tell you about sometimes capitalism, free market, and all this stuff, all these free trade policies has harmed not only America, but all over the world. You know, we reduce the tariffs, reduce the trade barriers, we destroy local economies and foreign societies, we allow these big corporations to move in, shut down manufacturing plants across the United States, which has cost a lot of jobs. And then this means that countries like China become very powerful, they manipulate our currency, and all these different things. And yet, of course, this means that these wealthy Chinese buy up America, destroy our sovereignty, and a lot of Americans from 16 to 64-year-olds are out of the labor force because the corporations had the freedom to outsource, which was one of the factors why our wages went down. And this was one of the reasons why unions were busted in the 1980s and 90s, but also hijacked as well to become more and more inefficient. The private sector unions. Believe me, I'm very critical of public sector unions. And this is one of the things. And now you've got Walmart, where the CEO makes several hundred times the bottom employee. We don't have any regulation for that, believe it or not. And then now these government employees are probably the alternative jobs. And then many of the Walmart employees have to rely on government assistance. And this is one of the inefficiencies that you probably have with capitalism. This is one of the things. And then many of the products that people buy in a capitalist economy may be very, very addictive. As we talked about cigarettes, drugs, prescription drugs, we all have the freedom to pursue these things. And what about the capitalist free market mantra, where corporations can basically hire lots and lots of low-skilled immigrants, and basically, whether they're legal or not, and downprice wages for American workers. This is one of the flaws of the Koch brothers' Reason Foundation agenda, is that they don't seem to criticize immigration. In fact, they seem to be supportive of massive legal or illegal immigration, and that's why in some cases they've been losing a lot of supporters. Corporations and these wealthy people come along because one of the inefficiencies of capitalism, not just in America, but even real capitalist societies like Hong Kong and Singapore, it leads to a lot of inequality. And a lot of inequality leads to lack of trust among the community. It leads to increased chance of a lot of other social problems, as America has more social problems overall than many developed societies that are more equal, but more importantly, it leads to inequality of wealth and income. And one of the results of that is that this is how you get Soros, the Koch brothers, all these wealthy people to manipulate our elections, and it leads to a massive divide of power. And we've seen inequality skyrocket since the 1970s and 80s. And then again, capitalism could also mean imperialism, destroying local economies, basically doing currency manipulation. What's a capitalist viewpoint of banking? Should banks be free to create out of money out of nowhere, which basically devalues our currency? What is capitalism point of view? Now, certainly capitalists are against a central bank known as the Federal Reserve. But even before, when we had this Federal Reserve in 1913, we still had lots of banking issues and failures. So this is why sometimes regulation can actually be very, very reasonable. The bottom line is that nevertheless, profit-taking doesn't always lead to the best interests of society. In other words, when you have a lot of, for an example, selective industries making huge amounts of profits, whether it's Goldman Sachs, whether it's just many other companies, they don't necessarily make massive profits like big pharma that actually help the benefit of society. Now, sometimes profit-taking actually benefits, but it isn't always the case. If I were to sell my stocks in the securities market and I make massive profits, nobody really got helped at all. Now, you can also argue if I take those profits and actually help and contribute to the community now that I have more money, that can actually work. But the point is, profit-taking doesn't always lead to the best interest of the community. Mr. Stossel doesn't tell you that, well, we had massive deregulation, we had the trade policies expanded throughout the 80s and 90s with NAFTA and China trade, but nevertheless, of course, however, we see that many economic problems grew, mergers and acquisitions, wealth inequality skyrocketed, and the middle class was struggling more and more and more. Now, he says that, well, we have to criticize Bernie Sanders. And again, I'm critical with Bernie Sanders on a number of issues. How, well, there's a lot of wealth inequality, that how he talks about that, and that we need socialism. And I understand he's wrong. But where he is right is that from the period of the 1940s and the 1970s, when we had better economic policy, when we had reasonable regulation, when we had stronger private sector unions, everybody in every side of the economic ladder, low income, middle class, and upper income, was experiencing their incomes grow more efficiently. But now, since the 1980s, we've seen really the wealthy people get really, really wealthy, but everybody else have been struggling to catch up. So in other words, back in the post-war period, almost everybody got, for an example, a 30% increase in their wages. Now we see, since the 1980s, where the wealthy see an increase of their wages of 80%, and then the bottom 60% see an increase of their wages of only about 10%. So really, the economic distribution gains has not really applied so well among everybody else. So this is one of the issues, one of the flaws. So this is where some issues where Bernie Sanders actually gets it right. However, one of the issues with capitalism is that you have to understand that not every sector of the economy, the private sector, can do very, very well. This is one of the reasons why, from what I believe, that the healthcare industry, it was illegal to make a profit before 1973 with the HMO Act that was passed by Richard Nixon. And a lot of people argue that, yes, even though single-payer healthcare system is not necessarily the most efficient way to do it, you can still go back to the 1960s policies where healthcare was actually a lot more cheaper. Now, Stossel is right, nevertheless, that back in the day, fewer people had health insurance, and health insurance actually makes healthcare costs a lot more expensive. So let's bring back the old-fashioned system of healthcare, and as well as college tuition. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. Sometimes regulation and higher taxes can actually harm the economy. One of the best examples of that is if you look at within the states like New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and especially California, where taxes are higher and higher than ever before. There's so many regulations that many people and businesses are leaving. Now, the problem with the Reason Foundation is that they don't tell you that one of the reasons why they have all these higher taxes and regulations is because the pumping of the immigrant vote, which of course they tend to vote for higher government services and more corrupt politicians, which allow this to happen. So one of the largest threats to minimal government is massive immigration. So this is just to show you proof that California, which could happen here in Nevada, here in Las Vegas, that more taxes and more regulation can actually be pretty harmful. It is usually the case, but it's not always the case. And this is where, of course, the Reason Foundation is incredibly misleading. This is why a lot of these think tanks, these organizations, can be very dangerous. They can be right on a lot of other issues, but nevertheless, they miss out on a lot of other few issues, which makes the public misled, misunderstood, and this is why we have a lot of the problems that we're facing in society. So for an example, where can higher taxes actually work? I support higher taxes among immigrants who send their money to foreign countries, a remittance tax of maybe 5 to 30%. I also support a tax on Wall Street transactions of over $1 million. Which means that if you have all these speculators in the high frequency trading, we see that it really doesn't benefit our economy. We can raise a lot of money and discourage all this nasty speculation that's happened in our real estate market, that's manipulated our economy, the commodities market, and so forth. And at the same time, we can lower taxes for the bottom 95% of Americans. So this is actually where taxes actually help, believe it or not. So anyway, once again, I support capitalism more than I do with socialism, communism, or whatever. However, I do believe capitalism still has flaws, and I do believe, nevertheless, we have to have reasonable regulation and some taxes. But ultimately, I think probably a more better and more efficient system is I suggest you look into the resource-based economy, the Zeitgeist movement, because their theories, their analysis, and their solutions actually make more sense, especially if we continue to see a lot more jobs that are going to continue to be eliminated thanks to massive technology. So we could see this, and we are seeing more of a sharing economy moving away from private ownership with the Uberization that we're seeing. So we could be headed there. I suggest you look at that movement. All right, anyway, thank you guys so much. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please share, please subscribe, and if you can, please donate to the link below. Take care.